Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Sharat, and I'm the host and moderator for today's webinar. So, today's webinar is all about understanding the P2P journey. So, when I say P2P journey, it means POC to production journey of startups and enterprises who are in the blockchain space. It's also important to highlight why most of the POCs they fail to make a smooth transition to production, and even if they do so, they face a lot of struggle when they have to confront with the competition and market forces. So today, to discuss more on this, I'm joined by Mark Caraway. Mark leads the partnerships at BlockApps. Welcome, Mark, to the webinar, and I look forward to listening to your thoughts and insights on how one can scale POCs into production successfully. Mark, over
Yeah,
to you.
yeah. Thanks, Sharat, and very excited to chat about this today. I think it's not only timely in terms of where blockchain is from a technology, but certainly when we think about the current environment, one of the things that we're seeing is companies are not shying away from blockchain necessarily, but they're really looking to extract value quicker. So I think this is a great topic today, and look forward to a great discussion.
Sure.
And so I think we'll give it just a couple more minutes. And
Mhm.
for everyone in attendance, we'll be doing a poll today as well. So we'll kind of kick off the dialogue just to get an understanding of where folks are in their blockchain journey. And we'll send that poll through in a couple of minutes.
Great. So can you just pull that poll up?
Yeah, I can pull that poll.
Yeah.
So there's two questions here, and if everyone could just make sure you hit next so that you see the second question as well. And so after you answer the first one, just hit next at the bottom instead of save.
So I could see many people are saying that the current COVID situation, it has not impacted their blockchain POC. I mean, it's more than 40%, so it looks like a good figure.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the final tally, but
Mhm.
it looks like we're seeing more people saying that it's accelerated their blockchain POC versus canceled entirely. So it looks like
Yeah, I
we're
think people
seeing.
are utilizing this pandemic time or the lockdown period to work on new ideas, and that's why maybe more blockchain POCs are coming up.
Yep. And yeah, just a reminder for everyone to hit next so you get the second question on the poll. You can see more folks have answered the first question than the second at this point.
So,
Awesome.
so Mark, in the meantime, could you please tell us more about what is the best way to start a blockchain POC so that in the meantime, once we have the results out, we can start talking about it as well?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about starting a blockchain POC, I think certainly having clear values is kind of one of the biggest steps, and just making sure that you've vetted alternatives, right? And I think certainly as blockchain is still somewhat of a new technology, there's still this goal to potentially bring blockchain into areas where there may be other solutions. And so, it's always good to vet that up front, so you feel just a little bit better going into that. And we'll talk through that a little bit today, around the, how you can, rescue and save a POC that you maybe haven't vetted the alternatives ahead of time.
Hmm. Yep. So, do we have the results ready of the poll? Oh,
Yes, we do. So I can stop the poll now, or I can just leave it open for those who join later. But it
mhm.
looks like we've got a good crowd. That over 75% of folks here have been directly or indirectly involved in a blockchain POC. So excited to have an good open dialogue. So certainly for those who have been involved, we're eager to field your questions and feedback based on the dialogue today. And looks like on the COVID side, there's a large portion where it has delayed or deprioritized the blockchain POC, but there's actually a larger portion that has said there's either been no change or it's accelerated your blockchain POC. So it looks to be about split between delay or acceleration or no change.
Mhm.
And so I'll close this, and maybe we can kick off the dialogue, the presentation.
Sure.
So today, what we wanted to talk about first and foremost is just symptoms of a struggling POC. So how can you identify if what you're working on is either having issues now or may have issues in the future that may be unforeseen? So we'll kind of walk through those first. And so there's really 7 main symptoms. Certainly, if you cannot add users easily, your POC is very small. Maybe there's only one unique type of entity, or it's becoming very complex to add users. The second one is difficulty for participants to agree. This could be outright disagreements, but it could also just be there's not enough information to make a decision, or there's no way to satisfy all parties involved. Um, the third one is something we're going to talk a lot about today. Is you're still finding that there's still a lot of manual work. Even within the POC area, you're having to reconcile. You're still pushing, manually. You're having to, call over the phone to align. There's not a lot of, automation around what's going on. And you find yourself having, instead of one database administrator, you're having multiple database administrators and potentially some duplicate entry. So a lot of the challenges you still see with the database, you may see with a blockchain POC that's struggling. The fourth is value is disappearing, and so this could mean that the value you thought you would receive is now not as clear, or the value has completely disappeared as you're building and developing. What you thought would pan out may not be working out so well. The fifth symptom is the time to value is too far. So there's maybe no clear path for success. Maybe you have an exciting product, but you can't figure out how to make it work in real life, or it just seems like too far in the distant future where you'll receive real value. Um, you know, Six is funding disappearing. So folks who initially funded the project are now starting to pull back, or users or participants who were going to add to funding and help support the production funding are walking away. And then the last is an interesting one where you may be building this POC, you're very excited about it, and then all of a sudden you hear about your neighbor in the same industry building the exact same POC, but they just work at a competitor or a different institution. And so these are kind of the top main symptoms of an unhealthy POC.
Mhm. So, Mark, would you say that it's important to ensure that even if you're building a POC, you should be open to change and you should make it possible to onboard new users?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key values of a POC is you can figure those things out. But I think there should be some flexibility built into the system, not just
Hmm.
from a technology point of view, but also from the operating model, because certainly things will change, grow, and evolve, from the POC and beyond. And
Hmm.
it's good if you've kind of put that into the operating model not necessarily seeing change as a challenge, but something you've accepted early on, and you have a plan for change.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so, what now? I want to talk through what we've kind of identified some of the symptoms of an unhealthy POC, but here's what that would mean for you, certainly in the long run. Why is this happening? What is the underlying cause for these issues? So the first issue, not being able to add users, it could be a couple of things. Certainly, the technology may not be flexible enough to add users. We've seen some where the technology is you've made design decisions on the front end, and you're really stuck with those. And so if new users don't fit into those original design decisions, then you either have to decide to scrap and start all over, or the new users may have to adapt or not be involved. Or the privacy is either all or nothing. We've seen this in other issues where privacy is so rigid that you either have full privacy or no privacy, and it's hard to find that nice medium-sized balance. The other challenge, to your point, Sharat, is maybe they just didn't consider this on the front end, that you built a POC for specific users, but there was no consideration for other users who may be coming in later. The second cause, if you're finding it difficult to agree, certainly a lot of this goes back to a lack of a governance framework. So that what is the operating model? What is the ownership model? How are decisions made? Who breaks ties? In the technology, is there a consensus mechanism built in to break ties? Is there a mechanism built in if there's a lack of agreement, or if something new comes up that wasn't immediately determined? So I think it's there's not a framework in place, and it's not flexible enough to handle unique situations. The third symptom, if it's acting like a traditional database, what this means is you're still missing the point of decentralization. You haven't really kind of bought into the value of blockchain as a networking tool versus just a larger database. And so typically there's still centralized aspects of this system where changes are not happening through the blockchain. There's a lot of this off chain, and so with the blockchain, there should be no need for certainly multiple data administrators, and there'd be no need for everyone to have separate copies, because the blockchain kind of retains copies of all records for each user. So a lot of this is just haven't fully bought into decentralization and distributed ledgers. And the fourth symptom, what causes this? Typically, if your value is disappearing, you aim too high. You were not specific enough, and we've seen this quite a bit, especially with governments, because they have such lofty goals and really a large population to satisfy. And so it's sometimes harder for those larger organizations, larger networks to start smaller. And so when you aim bigger, you start to see some of that getting peeled away, and you get in this situation where you may have to choose who to satisfy, or by trying to satisfy everyone at once, you actually satisfy no one in the system. So it's really good to kind of rally around who is involved and what are the target focus areas, and finding that lowest bar of value. If you're finding the time to value is too far away, a lot of times, we call this building in a bubble. You've got this great product, this great tool, but you didn't consider, reality. You didn't consider the real world, the current systems in place. You went in and said, we're going to disrupt an entire, ecosystem. And by doing so, you didn't talk to the parties in that ecosystem or consider them in the design, because there was assumptions made that you would just rip and replace the ecosystem, but that's typically not what happens. And so I think we found here that in this case, you're building in that bubble, and even if you do plan on replacing ecosystem participants or middlemen, you should still try to understand, and consider them in the design framework and why they're there in the first place.
Mhm.
If you're finding that the funding is disappearing, quite simply, you had a poor ROI framework, and you may not have considered value for all the parties. And so again, your ROI framework was built around a database and not a blockchain.
So I could see the value disappearing is very much linked to the funding also disappearing the same way, right? So would you say that it's better to start small and then create value for all the participants so that you have the right funds in place as well? You don't run short of funds.
Yeah, it's easier to start small because it's much easier to point to value for two or three entities or four in a small network versus 10, right? Because if you start with 10 entities or more than two solutions, you have to map value for every piece in a larger system, and you have to map it as a network. So just the larger you aim, the larger your value framework needs to be, and the more complex your ROI framework needs to be. And so, I think to your point, yeah, it's easier to start small because you can attach value to a smaller network easier than a larger network off the bat. And if you're starting to see multiple blockchains in the same industry, I think a little bit here is they still haven't bought into the true nature of a blockchain as a distributed and non-centralized ledger. But the blockchains, in essence, are meant to satisfy the entire network of challenges. And so you'll see that either governance wasn't created appropriately, they didn't create the right rules for the system, because a properly created governance system can still allow for competition, and in fact, it should still be a part of the blockchain network. So there should be no reason to have multiple competing blockchains when you can have competition, on the shared ledger. But then the other challenge is potentially privacy. I think companies still didn't trust in the privacy, or didn't find a technology that allowed for privacy that they felt was secure enough to keep their information separate from their competitors. So really, when you're seeing multiple blockchains in an industry, more than likely they haven't thought through the governance and privacy modules, and ultimately they'll have to do this anyway, because you'll start to see vendors and suppliers and distributors of an industry say, I don't want to join 5 blockchain networks. I want to join one, or I want what I do on one network to map across. So these multiple competing blockchains will have to come together in some fashion anyway. So I think it's just good to start thinking about governance and privacy ahead of time. And so next we can talk through, really in detail how you can fix some of these issues. And so the first issue, again, is, not being able to add new users. I think that, again, it's good to start and understand that it's not a centralized access management. It's really not even federated, but it's truly decentralized. And so even when users may not be actively involved in the POC, you should still plan for them to be part of the network, and have a space for any and all participants that you think would be here. And so you don't necessarily need to design the entire user type, but just have a space for them, and consider them in the design considerations. But you should also choose a technology with privacy and governance that's flexible, because I think that's the biggest thing. Is you're seeing new users come in that may change the governance dynamics. And so if you've got a technology that has a rigid governance structure or one size fits all governance, then it's going to be very difficult to have different users who have different rules and needs around the technology. So I think a good kind of checklist is make sure you define all the role types that could ever use the system, and maybe of those you're still only utilizing 3 or 4 in the POC, but you've considered the impact of others on the front end.
So would you say that even the way you define user access will also have an impact on if you can onboard more users going forward?
Yeah, because if you made access available to only 3 user types, you'll be able to onboard as many of those users as you want. But again, the larger the system grows outward and wide, it will definitely impact the speed and how quickly you can scale. if you're having to go back from the beginning and redefine the users and the user journeys after you've already mapped a system out.
Yeah. So user access is going to be a crucial component when you're designing a POC, right?
Yeah. So the access of, how they access, what levels of access, where they access, where they're connected. And again, it's just good to consider all the users, even if you're not building the POC around, all of them from the beginning.
Yep.
And so the second piece, if it's difficult to agree, these are just some of the questions that, you should think about from a network level. I think, when you're looking at traditional databases, it's really a point-to-point decision. So there's two people involved. You either agree or you disagree. You find some, level of agreement. But with a network, you have, potentially layers of decisions and, levels of decisions. So when you start thinking about decision making at, highest level and lowest level and levels in between, I think you'll start to see that your governance framework will match more of what a network is supposed to do versus a database. And then within the network, who are the influencers? Who may not have the highest level decision making, but they may hold a lot of influence on bringing and growing the ecosystem. And then when you look through the technology itself, is there a process to handle conflicts via smart contracts? Is the technology set up in a way, if there is a conflict or some disagreement through the data, that there's a process in place? And adding on to that, is there a catch-all process? Certainly you can't imagine every scenario, but what is that situation if it's not a conflict, it's not a disagreement, but it's just not something that has been mapped for? What is that kind of catch-all process? So that should be outlined in the governance framework, but also mapped into the technology. And then I think, again, as we're talking about POC scaling, you should actually think through who decides how to scale, who influences scaling the most. Is it, in your POC, is it the customer side? Is it, being pulled through by the customer? Is it the manufacturing side? Are they pushing through new products? Is it the suppliers and distributors? Is it really, the growth of the ecosystem in the middle? So who's really going to be integral in scaling? And they should be, having one of the loudest voices in how you scale. So I think if you can answer these questions and map to the technology, you'll have better agreement, as things certainly grow and scale. And so the third one, if you're having the issue of it's still acting like a database, a good analogy is, blockchain is the roads, where I think database is really, more of a car. You're in a database, a company's using that database to get from, to solve a specific challenge. Like I need, 4-wheel drive, et cetera. I need these pieces on the car. But what a blockchain network is, it's really, you can see here, it's combining multiple databases. And so what the blockchain is really about, it's about the connectivity. It's not about the beginning, and the end. It's about everything in the middle and providing that road for business to be executed on. And so I think that's, a good way to think about, blockchain. If you're visual like me, being able to combine, multiple databases into one logical network is a good way that I like to think about that. And so what you're thinking about is not necessarily what are the rules of the database, how is it structured, but you're thinking about is how can we provide connectivity? How do we entertain permissions throughout this road? Who has access to what areas of the network? And then how do we translate from one system to the other within our network? So if you start thinking about it as an interconnected road instead of the car itself and the solution, it's really the groundwork for everything to be built on top of it.
Mm-hmm. So choosing the right road is also important, right? I mean, choosing the right platform, whether it's scalable, whether it also supports growth with other partners in the ecosystem.
Exactly. And I think, when you think about the road analogy, a lot of roads were basically built to connect the major cities, right? So if you're thinking about your network and your ecosystem, who are the major, players and how do we connect those first? And then what you saw with roads later is, after the interstate highways were created, then the state highways were created within, specific ecosystems. So once you've kind of mapped out the larger roads, then you can start building those smaller network connectivity pieces around, the individual ecosystems within the network. And so the next challenge, if you're facing value that's disappearing, again, your use case may not have been specific enough. So it's probably good to relook at the scope. Is the scope of what you have today the same as what you initially planned on? And maybe taking an honest assessment of, is that scope too large? Did we aim too high? Is the value not achieved in that scope because maybe we missed the real value? So I think it's really important to kind of look back at your scope, doing some rescoping exercises, or at least making sure that everyone kind of realigns and agrees on the scope going forward. But the second piece is, does everyone agree blockchain is the best solution? And then more importantly, does everyone agree on why blockchain is the best solution? Because I think that's something that we've seen in certain situations where one party is getting certain aspect out of blockchain. They want the the immutability that nothing can be changed, where the other party may want the full audit trail or full transparency, right? And I think blockchain in essence provides transparency, but it also provides segmented privacy. And sometimes the privacy aspect and the transparency aspect are at odds with each other. And so which is more important? What do you focus on first? Is it driving transparency through the entire ecosystem, or building up privacy in a way that all the ecosystem can participate and feel comfortable putting data into the project? And so it's not necessarily about agreeing on the value of blockchain in the long run, although that's important, but it's agreeing on the value right now. What should we do first? Where do we start? And so I think that's an important thing too. If you're seeing the value disappear, maybe take an honest assessment of all the parties, and have each party write down what are the top 2 to 3 values blockchain brings to this system, and see if those are aligned. See if everyone agrees on the value. Certainly it's always good to vet alternatives. We've had companies talk to us and say that they looked at blockchain, and while they felt blockchain was a great solution, there's something they felt more comfortable with that could still provide 80% the value. And well, although blockchain could provide that extra 20% of the value, it may have not been the right solution at the moment. And so I think it is good to vet alternatives, and really that should hopefully either clear up why you're using blockchain, or at least give you a better sense of, hey, maybe there is something else we should look at. And then the last section is partnerships. And so we see this quite a bit on value, is that in order to actually achieve the value that you're looking at, blockchain may only be 20% of the solution or less. And so are you partnering with the right firms who maybe has the data set you're needing, the machine learning algorithm that's needed to kind of cleanse the data, or make assumptions or reports or analyze the data? Are you connected to the IoT device that's capturing the data? Have you connected to certain systems? So I think a lot of the times you may go into this and saying, blockchain can really add a lot of value, which a lot of times it can. But really, when you look at blockchain as the road, you still need those pieces on top of the road to actually, create the end value. And so, partnerships is definitely something key. And so if you find your value shrinking, maybe look for that partner who can bring that extra data set, bring extra clarity, bring extra connectivity that can add value back to the overall network.
So, Mark, would you say that if I'm onboarding a new user on my platform or on my POC idea, is it really important to make him believe the shared value, so that the overall value doesn't drop, or the all the partners in the ecosystem are in agreement about the value in
I
general.
think that before you try to make them agree on the value, I think it starts with a question and asking them what they see as the value. And so before you spend time teaching them about everything you've built and the values, you should ask them first. So the new user, part of the onboarding process should be, what is the main value that you're trying to achieve, or what do you see as a potential value here? And so hopefully you're obviously hoping that aligns with everything you've created. But if you see that disagrees, maybe you can have a conversation with them and educate them on the value. But it could also mean that potentially in your early value models you left out key value for other participants. And so I think it's important to, before explaining to the new user what blockchain does, you should ask the new user, why are they here at this table? What are they looking for? And making sure that aligns with either what they can receive now or the roadmap for the POC, to make sure that that's still on the table. Because if those are in disagreement, then usually means that something still needs to be worked out on the value model. And so that actually leads us to the next piece. If trying to bring value quicker. So if you are finding that you've got maybe a good product, you like what you're building, but the time to value is too far away, or you thought you would have achieved value much quicker, but it looks farther away. Again, you're probably building in a bubble. And so I like this picture of this kid in the sandbox. He's probably in his mind creating something very exciting. And something that's very entertaining and useful, but in the sandbox he's kind of ignorant of the world around him, right? And that's okay, for children. But when you're looking at blockchain solution that is meant to revolutionize the world, you can't revolutionize the world without being a part of the ecosystem. And so even if you're looking to displace or replace current ecosystems, it doesn't just happen overnight. And so I think you've got to engage the participants of the ecosystem. And what we found is that's actually, an easier, quicker way for blockchain to be adopted, because there's all these parties in the ecosystem. A lot of them are not, averse to change, right? If they see that blockchain will be the new future, they will get in the boat with you and they will row with you. And I think that's, the goal is that, yes, you want to build an exciting product, but you also want to do it in a way that engages the community that you're meant to serve and engages the ecosystem and the players involved. And I think we see that a lot where, you're trying to displace middlemen within a supply chain, and maybe the technology can do that, but those participants are, still capturing a lot of the value today. And by understanding that they can either choose to get on board and get in the boat with blockchain, or they may not survive the next 10 years. I think you'll find that a lot of companies are actually more reasonable to adopting a new future that is, better for all parties. So I think this is, key for us, is just making sure that you've kind of validated with the ecosystem what you're doing, and really bring them to the table.
So, Mark, what would you say to startups who work in a regulated environment of, let's say, a sandbox, a regulatory sandbox, and they're working on a POC, and when they decide to move outside the sandbox and try and test the solution in the market, they face they face a different world altogether. So, what would you recommend to these people, how they can make that transition smooth from a regulatory sandbox to a real market condition?
And so when you say regulatory sandbox, so working alongside government bodies in a
Yeah.
government sandbox. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think regulations are meant to be is in some ways restrictive, right? It's basically, regulations are meant to say, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do, here's how you do that. And so I think if you're starting from that environment, it's actually a good place to start, because hopefully there's a circle around the context. And so I think in that standpoint, your earlier question actually may hold more weight, in the sense of, if you're building in a regulatory sandbox and a new user comes in and it, says, well, the value you've created is not the value that I'm looking for. I think from a regulatory standpoint, there's a little bit of clarity of saying, if you don't operate within the regulatory sandbox, then you may not have access to operate at all. And so I think it's good if you're in that regulatory sandbox to really again understand the flexible nature, where you can bend and where the rules may apply. But I think when you're moving from that regulated box, you should have hopefully defined a big enough space to allow business to operate in. But I think in that standpoint, it is more about educating the new users of, we've spent time and kind of built the regulations around what's to be created with blockchain. So, you should follow kind of inside this box.
Mhm. Thanks. So, Mark, at this point in time, I will pick one question from Mosam. So, Mosam wants to know that in this COVID situation, the governments are looking for solutions to track people movement. So, is there a use case that can be explored, or do you have any idea around that?
Yeah, this is. I mean, we've had conversations with a few areas about this. I think that it certainly depends on the country that you're in and what kind of regulations are involved with tracking consumers' movement, because certainly that could be considered private data that they don't want to share. And so I think to your point, there's probably a regulatory sandbox that needs to be considered first, and making sure that you're not infringing on individual privacies that go outside the bounds of your own legal framework. But there's a lot of ways you can do that, and certainly with IoT devices or customer individuals themselves kind of reporting. But what we found in a specific country is they had border patrol asking folks, have they been in any environment where the disease was prevalent, and they would say no. But because they were able to see where they traveled before, sometimes you have individuals who don't think they were in infected areas, but they actually were. And so there are times when having a little bit of visibility can actually protect the individual from themselves. And so there's ways to do that from, certainly even, Apple Watches, your phone. There's a lot of ways you can do that. But I think that when you start to roll that out to a mass scale, it certainly gets quite complicated. I think there's a lot of legal and ethical things to consider. But I think that the nice thing that blockchain can bring to a solution like that is not just the value that the governments need of where people are, but the transparency. So satisfying the individual of saying, here's how we're using your data. And after a crisis situation, we can prove to you that maybe we've turned off the solution, or it's no longer tracking you. And so just giving the ability for the individual to participate in that process as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think DIDs, or decentralized identity management solutions, will work very well in these cases, where at least the individual liberty and privacy would be preserved.
Yeah, there's always that balance, right? Because I think that you've got the end participant that wants to take care of their privacy, but there's also the kind of the greater good conversation that happens. And so I think that should be an active dialogue from both parties involved. And so again, getting everyone in the boat on the front end, it's not just government building that in the sandbox, but really having the end individuals helping lead the way.
Yep.
And so we want to talk a little bit about the ROI framework. If your funding is disappearing, or you're just having trouble getting the first or second round of funding, you really just want to walk through this again. Is ROI is not a single decision, so it's a shared network framework. So what you want to do is rank the unique participants from most to least in 3 key areas. So who's receiving the most value? Who do we think will provide the most funds, or who has the most funding, and who's using it on a day in and day out basis, right? And so this is kind of giving a quick overview of the sections. And so ideally what you get is hopefully when you compare the leaders in each area, you should hopefully see the same entity at the top, ideally, or somewhat near the top. Because if you don't have the same entities receiving the value that are funding it, you're going to find funding drying up very quickly. So, you may see something like this. And this first section, when you talk through the value, this is the creation. So you're not going to get any POC off the ground without the help of the top participants here. So you want to make sure that in the POC, you've at least included, the top few participants here. So that's the creation aspect. The second level, the funding, this is really where you start seeing that large scale development, right? This isn't, it isn't something you can do for free. It's not something that, costs $0. You need to make sure that the funding is there. And so these groups will be instrumental, in either, later stage POC after you've kind of really mapped out the original, to kind of getting to a point to where you're ready to scale and kind of making sure that you're moving smoothly through that process. And then the last section, the usage, there's no way to scale a POC or a production level blockchain solution without users. And so if you're having different users than you are funding it, you just want to make sure that they are incentivized to use the system. So when looking at the three of these together, this is kind of your ROI framework for a shared network. And so by looking at this ahead of time, you can kind of map the stages and understanding, where you are in the process and who needs to be incentivized. And so there's a couple other challenges that we want to talk through, but really, the remaining challenges are revolved around scale. So why is scale so tough? So certainly we've talked about a few things that are prerequisites to scale. Really, really well-defined users, a process for making decisions. You need to understand blockchain. It's a network and not a database. You have to have clear value defined, and funding identified. And so these are kind of the keys for scale. The other one that we haven't talked about, and what I want to talk about now, is you need to map these rules properly into the blockchain. I think that's where we start seeing the challenges on the technology side. When you hear from some folks that the technology isn't mature, I think it's just, you haven't found the right technology that can handle these rules. And so the first aspect is governance. And so again, in a database, it's kind of simple. You give users access, and maybe some have higher level access. But in a blockchain network, again, with layers, you kind of think about it like this, with concentric circles, expanding out. But if you think about, a house or, a housing situation, you have the perimeter fence, right? And so, only people come into your fence that are maybe invited guests, right? If you're throwing a party, you're having a barbecue, all your neighbors can come in to the perimeter fence. But in the barbecue, maybe you don't let everyone in your house, right? So you have the exterior door to your house, and so that's for very close friends and family, people that and trust. And then within the house, you have the office door. So right, this is potentially just for the parents, the owners of the house, or certain group of people using the office door. And then within that office, you have your cabinet, right? So you as an individual, you're the owner of that cabinet. And so your cabinet is separate, but it also sits in the door in the office, inside your house, inside the fence. And so you need to actually define the space like this for each participant. And so what you'll find is each participant will have, in some level, their own cabinet, their own space, but they will also meet other participants. And so it's good to define who's meeting in the cabinet area, who's meeting at the door, who's meeting at the fence, and who's not even allowed into the fence. And so when you define that space, the next thing you need to define in that space is, okay, what's publicly available information, what's private, right? So maybe you're inside the barbecue, and everyone can talk about the sports team, the local politics, etc., whatever they want to talk about. But what's private is still your own personal life, your own family situation. And so within the housing, you may find that there's family dynamics that are public, but maybe you as an individual, you have your own private approach to your business or your own private approach to something different. And so within each space, once you define the users and how they're connected within the ecosystem, you need to define, what's public and what's private in each layer. And then the last thing is what triggers permission. What gets somebody kicked out of the barbecue, right? If they're drinking too much, are they going to be asked to leave? Or what gets somebody invited, right? If they've made side dishes, that's the only way that you're invited to this barbecue. So I think it's important to define those triggers at each layer. And that's, again, where blockchain is different from a database. We're not really about storing data. If you go into a blockchain and think about storing data, it's not the right blockchain. Blockchain's not going to solve that problem. What blockchain can do is create rules and permissions to move data. How do you get access? How do you move and share data? And so those permission triggers should be really at every layer of the ecosystem as you map it out. And so the last piece, when you think about scale, co-opetition or multiple blockchains, again, blockchain was meant for having, partially public and shared information, but also having each end user on the edge creating their own space and managing their own space. And so competition should be able to be mapped on blockchain. And like I said, you're going to see multiple blockchains in the same industry start to come together and say, how do we work together? Our largest customer said they don't want to join two blockchains. How do we work together? Because the regulator said they don't want to regulate 10 blockchains. They're going to regulate one, and they all need to have the same rules. And so, again, you need to think about it as distributed ecosystems. So in this situation, you have each red house is a competitor, right? And so they have maybe one line to each other that they share. But then within each competitor, they have their own ecosystem. But you'll see those ecosystem participants that may be connected to, multiple of those competitors. And that's perfectly normal in a blockchain. And so I think what you want to do is really map competition. If you see yourself building alongside a competitor, separate blockchains, you should really try to find a technology that can bring both together. And so, again, look away from the blockchains that may be an all or nothing privacy solution, or look away from the blockchains that may have rigid privacy controls or very tough to handle privacy growth, and look towards ones that have layers of privacy. And so here's an example from our platform is you can have every buyer or every supplier can have their own chains and as many attached to them as you want. And so those can be point to point, but they can also be groupings. So each buyer can have different suppliers in different private chain networks. And so within those networks, they're able to share data specifically within the groups that they want. And when you map that out with layered governance, you'll see that you can do that on a macro scale as well as a micro scale. And so there should be no reason that competitors shouldn't be on the same blockchain, especially if they share the same customer, because that customer will, be able to push their data once. And if they share it separately to both competitors can get the data in real time at the same time. And so you'll make life much easier for customers by just, having everyone included on the same system. And again, it's a fully distributed ecosystem, and so it should have room for competition.
Mm-hmm. So would you say it's better to have competitors on a different blockchain or maybe side chains, so that when you are defining the layered governance, you promote the co-opetition, not the competition directly?
Well, I think the highest level of the governance, when you think about the permission, the fence, should be the industry, right? Nobody's operating in the agriculture industry, unless they're involved with food and agriculture, right? And so I think what you're doing is you're just mapping the industry dynamic as it is today, right? You're not going to see certain institutions kind of in the industry that don't belong there. And so I think you should start at that higher level, and then yes, you can have multiple different ecosystems, right? And so when you start at the higher level first, every participant has one private chain that's connected to the macro ecosystem. And then from there, all the other private networks that are created based around how the ecosystem is mapped today. So you should just map competition as it sits, right? And so if you know that you don't share any information with the competitor, then you just don't need to, right? And so the governance, the rule of the network could say, we're not sharing any information on the blockchain, and so nobody can see the macro level. But the only thing that the macro blockchain is used for is consensus within the technology. So even the users can't see, the macro level data. Only the blockchain technology itself can see that for consensus and for for the ecosystem.
Hmm. Or sharing information on need to know basis as well.
And so you can map the need to know, via smart contract, right? So just because you have a private chain between two companies doesn't mean that data has to go through that every day, right? And that's where you go back to the triggers. So if you agree that says, I want to share data with you, but you only want to share data with me if we both agree, then if I push data to you and we both don't agree, then that data comes back, right? So I think it's, mapping those triggers on what is the need to know basis.
And so, Mark, before you move on, I have one question from Stephen. Now, Stephen wants to know, in the current pandemic situation, international students, they are the most affected. And is there a way they can validate their identities and how their credential security can be managed using blockchain, or any POC which you have come across?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the student ecosystem, right? There's universities and employers and governments in this case when you have international. And so I think that there's ways you can map that where their credentials are getting validated by one or multiple parties in the network. And so what you would do is you'd have an international student kind of ecosystem that they all operate in. All of the participants around their ecosystem have said, I want to help validate this. So you could have companies like I've seen, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. They're doing things around technology credentialing now to help verify and validate those credentials. So maybe you get an industry body to stand up and say, I've tested and validated this. You get the university to say, just attest to this. And so one of our, key applications that we've partnered with is a document attestation. So it's similar to a resume, but in essence, the international student would create their own resume, send it to the university. The university would approve and attest to it. They would send it to, a technology company who could test their technology credentials. Then there may be a soft credentials testing software or solution that could test more of those softer skills. And then by the time it gets to the government, they can approve and say, yes, they're still allowed to work and live in this country. And so by the time that gets to the employer, they've had a document that was owned by the student, but that the student was not able to approve or disprove the credentials, so that that all of this has been validated by a third party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope that answers Stephen's question. I have one more question, Mark, from Will. Now, Will wants to know, are we pushing limits when it comes to scalability? If you were to talk about Strato's scalability part, what would you say?
Are we pushing limits in the sense, are we, getting towards the edge of limits, or are we pushing beyond limits, I guess?
Or scalability, how are we taking care of that?
How are we taking care of scalability? Yeah, I would say that, again, the biggest impediments to scale are being able to scale new user types, being able to scale more throughput, and being able to, scale, more complexity, more intricacy around regulations. And so I think, BlockApps has really taken the lead around user management and governance and technology. And so I think when you think about scale and you start hitting those walls of regulations, which we hit, very many times, that's kind of where, BlockApps itself or the technology companies, we can't scale regulations. So all we can do is map existing regulations. So we're working with regulators right now actively to let them know where we've hit the wall, right? We've got an international project that we need buy-in from both governments to be able to share a specific piece of information, and we don't have that, right? That's a scale limiting factor. And then when you think about the throughput and just the sheer magnitude of the volume, one of the things again that we do is we don't see ourselves as a data storage company, because as a technology we have the hash which can point to everything and give you that audit trail, but we still look for other technology databases to really scale kind of storage and throughput and really just computing power. So if you think about any kind of computing power, that scale is still being worked on by your traditional companies. But what we are trying to do is take that computing power, take those regulations, and we're scaling, mapping all of that to a distributed ecosystem. So we can scale the user access, the user management, the rules that are embedded into the technology, and scaling the automation, through the system.
Mhm. Yeah. And if I were to take the blockchain and road analogy a bit too far, I would say scalability is more like a mileage, where it would it would depend upon the road you are taking, or the platform which you have chosen. Would you agree to that, Mark?
Yeah, exactly. If you've ever lived in Texas and driven to Louisiana, the difference in the road is immediate. So you don't need to look up and realize you're in a different state. You can actually feel the difference, of the road. And I think, depending on the road that you're building for, the ecosystem, there may be, participants that have a more defined, ecosystem within the blockchain and more complex structure and more intricacy around it, and others may choose for more of a plain. So it's about the ecosystem, how it's set up, and the rules, right? When you go from Texas to Louisiana, the speed limit goes from 75 to 65. So it's still understanding that, hey, I've crossed into a new blockchain ecosystem, and now here are the new rules in that ecosystem.
Yeah, agree. Yeah.
And so, the last prerequisite for scale, and I'll just quickly go through this, is just being partnership minded. So there's kind of three ways you can partner for growth: is up and down the supply chain, starting from the materials to the customer. So maybe if you have the customer now, can you work towards the manufacturer? Or if you're at the manufacturer, can you work towards the customer? The second is just similar ecosystems, right? I'm a distributor, you're a distributor. We can both bring our customers to the table and satisfy growth together. And then to your point, that you mentioned, is the regulatory and political. Can we start with making sure every state in the country agrees on how we're rolling out a national blockchain system, or do we need to look at international bodies? This is something the World Economic Forum just put out as their minimal viable ecosystem. So I think it's important to note that they consider it, a 6-node network. They've included regulators and a bank. This is really around supply chain. But if you think about this as a minimal viable ecosystem, I think this is a good slide that can help you think through how you create room for new users, even if maybe you're only the retailer and the processing plant. Can you create space for the bank, the regulator, and the distributors on there? So that's just something to consider. I'm actually looking forward to my next webinar, which will discuss BlockApps Partner Network. We'll have some spotlights from various partners of ours that have global reach, industry expertise, and specific solutions. But very quickly at the end, I just want to talk through ROI, because that's really the whole goal of POC, is to prove value. And so if we go back to our prerequisites of user it's defined, if you've defined this, now you're able to easily onboard new users. So you can tell those that are controlling the budget and the future funding that, hey, we can scale quickly. We have a process for making decisions. So we've already built our operating model, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel for how we're going to do business in the future. We understand blockchain, so this is going to help you innovate quickly, because we understand how networks work and how you can share between multiple parties and not just a single database. We've identified clear value, so we have a solution that's tested, and we have an infrastructure backbone in blockchain as an ROI. We've identified funding ideally, and so I think that is direct ROI when you've got a strong ROI framework. We've mapped the rules properly on blockchain. So, it could be the end of data cleansing, right? If you've mapped the rules appropriately, the second you put the data on blockchain, you're not having to scrub data, reconcile data. I think this is a big one that people will be excited about as far as a POC ROI. And then the last one, we've already, included partners. So we've got an active ecosystem. And I think if you have these things in red, you've kind of built a strong ROI for your POC. And so I know we've got, I think we're at time now, but just thank you, Sharat, and everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for your insights. And I think the barbecue analogy was perfect in defining the layered governance and how every participant has to have a defined space so that governance models can be built around it. I believe the audience would find this session interesting as and insightful as well. And thanks again, Mark, for sharing your perspective on how POCs can be scaled faster into production. So thanks, Mark, for your time, and thanks everyone for joining in. Do check out the BlockApps page for future webinars.